She was 72 years old. She had walked 2 miles that morning, the same route she always took through the park near her house. Her daughter spoke to her on the phone that afternoon. She sounded bright, energetic, completely herself. She mentioned she was making lamb stew for dinner, her husband's favorite. She said she felt good. She said she would call again on Sunday. She never made that call. Her husband found her at 5:47 the next morning, still in bed, perfectly still, already cold. The paramedics said it had happened sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning. A catastrophic cardiac event. No struggle, no sound, no chance for anyone to intervene. Her last checkup had been 6 weeks earlier. Her doctor had told her she was doing remarkably well for her age. Blood pressure managed, cholesterol acceptable, resting heart rate steady. And yet, at some point in the dark hours of that night, her heart simply stopped. Her family spent months searching for an explanation. How does a woman who walked 2 miles a day, who took her medication without fail, who saw her doctor every 3 months, how does she just die in her sleep with no warning whatsoever? The answer was not hidden in her genetics. It was not buried in some rare, undiagnosed condition. It was sitting on her kitchen counter. It was in the timing of her evening meal and a habit she had practiced every single night for more than 30 years. A habit that research has now clearly and repeatedly linked to exactly this kind of sudden nocturnal cardiac failure. A habit so completely ordinary that no one, not once in her entire life, had ever thought to warn her about it. I want to tell you about a second person. A man, 67 years old, who woke at 3:15 in the morning, drenched in sweat with a crushing sensation across his chest and his left arm completely numb. His wife drove him to the emergency room. He survived, barely. When the cardiologist reviewed his case afterward, the man said something that stopped the room. He said, "I did everything right. I took my pills. I watched what I ate. I walked every day. How is this happening to me?" The cardiologist asked one question. "What time do you eat your last meal, and how long after that do you go to bed?" The man thought for a moment and said, "I eat around 8:30, sometimes 9. I am in bed by 10:30 at the latest." The cardiologist nodded slowly and said, "That is very likely what has been loading your heart for this exact event for years." The man stared at him, and then he said the same thing I have heard dozens of times from patients in his position. "No one ever told me that, not once, not in all these years." I am sharing these stories with you today because I hear versions of them constantly. And at the center of every single one is the same habit. The same completely normalized, completely unquestioned evening behavior that millions of adults over 60 practice every single night without the faintest awareness that it is placing their heart under specific, measurable, documented danger during the hours when they are most vulnerable and least able to call for help. The woman who died was not unlucky. She was not genetically doomed. She died because a modifiable, correctable daily behavior was silently overloading her cardiovascular system every single night. And nobody ever connected that behavior to her risk in a way she could hear and act on. I am here to make that connection for you today. Stay with me through this entire conversation because what I am about to explain could genuinely be the difference between waking up tomorrow morning and not. The American Heart Association has documented for decades a phenomenon cardiologists refer to as nocturnal cardiovascular vulnerability. It is the well-established clinical reality that the risk of heart attack, stroke, and sudden cardiac death rises sharply during sleep, particularly between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning. This is not speculative. It is not emerging research. It is a validated, peer-reviewed, clinically recognized fact that has been confirmed across hundreds of studies spanning multiple decades and populations around the world. During these hours, the body undergoes specific hormonal shifts, autonomic nervous system transitions, and circulatory changes that a young, healthy cardiovascular system manages without difficulty. But in an older adult whose system has already accumulated decades of silent arterial wear, reduced elasticity, diminished autonomic responsiveness, those same transitions become potential triggers for catastrophic events. Here is what your body is supposed to do at night. In a healthy cardiovascular system, blood pressure follows a predictable circadian rhythm. It rises during active waking hours to support movement, cognition, and daily function. And it dips during sleep, typically falling 10 to 20% from the daytime peak. This nocturnal dip is not incidental. It is biologically essential. It is the window during which your heart genuinely rests. Your arterial walls decompress from the sustained pressure of the day. Your vascular system performs critical repair and maintenance that it simply cannot accomplish while you are active and upright. When this dip does not occur, when blood pressure remains elevated or actually rises during sleep, the consequences are serious, progressive, and thoroughly documented. Research estimates that between 30 and 50% of adults over 60 experience what is called a non-dipping pattern, meaning their blood pressure fails to drop adequately during sleep. A landmark study published in the journal Hypertension tracked more than 3,000 adults with an average age of 66 over a 4-year period. The finding was stark. Adults with non-dipping nocturnal blood pressure had more than double the risk of a major cardiovascular event, heart attack, stroke, or sudden cardiac death compared to those whose pressure dipped normally during sleep. Not a modest increase, more than double. And this elevated risk persisted regardless of how well their daytime blood pressure was controlled by medication. What makes this finding particularly alarming is that the non-dipping pattern produces no symptoms the person can feel. There is no chest pain at night. There is no sensation of pressure. There is no alarm bell. The individual lies in bed genuinely believing they are resting, genuinely believing their body is recovering, while their blood pressure holds at a level that if it had been recorded during a daytime office visit, would have prompted immediate clinical intervention. Your body has no overnight warning system for sustained vascular pressure. And for a heart already working harder than it should, hour after hour, night after night, week after week, the cumulative damage builds invisibly until the night it becomes visible in the worst possible way. A second major study published in the European Heart Journal analyzed ambulatory blood pressure data collected over full 24-hour cycles in more than 7,000 adults across multiple countries. The conclusion was unequivocal. Nocturnal blood pressure was a stronger independent predictor of cardiovascular death than daytime blood pressure in every age group studied. And the predictive gap widened with age. The older the person, the more their nighttime pressure mattered, and the less their daytime reading alone told the true story of their cardiovascular risk. Your afternoon reading at the clinic is showing your doctor one number. The number that actually predicts whether you survive the night could be entirely different, and no one is measuring it. So what is driving this dangerous non-dipping pattern in the majority of otherwise healthy older adults who have it? The research identifies the primary behavioral cause clearly, consistently, and across multiple independent cohorts spanning different countries and populations. It is not primarily a medication failure. It is not primarily genetic. It is a specific daily behavior practiced in the evening hours, so ordinary, so normalized, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that most people have never once in their lives connected it to what is happening inside their chest at 2 in the morning. That behavior is eating a substantial meal within 2 to 3 hours of going to sleep. Let me be very clear about something before I continue. Most adults over 60 who carry cardiovascular risk are genuinely trying. They take their medications faithfully. They attend their checkups. Many monitor their blood pressure at home, watch their sodium, try to stay active, and their doctors, for the most part, are doing exactly what the clinical system equips them to do. Measuring daytime blood pressure, running lipid panels, recording resting ECGs, adjusting medications based on office readings taken at 2 in the afternoon. These are real, evidence-based interventions with documented value. I am not dismissing any of them, but here is the structural gap that almost no patient is ever told about. Every single one of those standard interventions measures and manages what your heart is doing while you are awake, upright, and accessible. Almost none of the standard clinical conversation addresses what your cardiovascular system is doing during the 6 to 8 hours every night when you are horizontal, unconscious, alone, and completely unable to call for help if something goes catastrophically wrong. Your prescription was calibrated around your afternoon appointment. Nobody has any idea what your blood pressure is doing at 2:47 in the morning, and what it is doing at 2:47 in the morning may matter more than any reading your doctor has ever recorded. Researchers have given this phenomenon a name. They call it masked nocturnal hypertension. It refers to individuals whose daytime blood pressure appears well controlled, often with the help of medication, but whose nighttime pressure rises into dangerous territory without anyone knowing. Estimates suggest it affects 15 to 30% of adults currently taking blood pressure medication who genuinely believe their pressure is under control. Their monitoring protocol is entirely missing the hours that matter most. The reason this gap persists is not physician negligence. It is not carelessness. A standard medical appointment allows 8 to 12 minutes of clinical conversation. The medication adjustment, the lab review, the ECG, these are the immediate priorities of that window. The nuanced behavioral conversation about what time you eat dinner and what that timing does to your heart 6 hours later simply does not fit into the system as it currently operates. And so night after night, year after year, the habit continues. The pressure climbs in the dark, and the damage accumulates invisibly. Now, let me walk you through exactly what happens inside your body when you eat a substantial meal and go to bed 2 hours later. Because once you understand the mechanisms, you will never approach your evening the same way again. When you eat a substantial meal, your body initiates a massive, coordinated physiological response. Blood flow redirects toward the gastrointestinal tract to support digestion. Your sympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for alertness and cardiovascular activation, ramps up significantly to coordinate the digestive process. Heart rate increases, and in compensation for the redistribution of blood flow to the gut, systemic blood pressure rises. This is called the postprandial blood pressure response. In a young, healthy adult with elastic arteries and responsive autonomic regulation, this is a smoothly managed, transient fluctuation that resolves within an hour or two. In adults over 60, 3 specific age-related changes transform this routine response into a sustained cardiovascular burden that persists for hours. First, baroreceptor sensitivity, the precision of the pressure sensors in your blood vessel walls that signal your body to compensate for pressure changes, declines significantly with age. This means the compensating response arrives more slowly and with less accuracy. Second, arterial wall elasticity is reduced. The vessels are stiffer. Pressure waves travel more rigidly through the vascular system with less dampening, meaning each pressure spike hits harder and dissipates slower. Third, overall autonomic agility, the speed at which your cardiovascular system makes real-time adjustments, is diminished. The system reacts more slowly to every change. The combined result is that the blood pressure surge following a substantial meal in an adult over 60 is larger in magnitude, significantly longer in duration, and harder for the body to buffer back to normal than in a younger person. Research documents that this surge can persist for 3 to 5 hours in older adults before fully resolving. Apply that timeline to an evening meal eaten at 8:30 or 9 at night. The pressure peaks around 10:30 or 11. It is still elevated at midnight, at 1 in the morning, at 2, still operating at full force during precisely the window that the American Heart Association identifies as carrying the highest risk of fatal cardiac events. You are sending your heart into its most vulnerable hours of the day, carrying an elevated pressure load it was never designed to sustain overnight. And you are doing this not occasionally. You are doing this every single night. And your doctor, reviewing your perfectly acceptable 2 o'clock afternoon blood pressure reading, has absolutely no visibility into what is happening. Running simultaneously alongside the blood pressure surge is a second dangerous mechanism. When you eat a meal containing carbohydrates, which virtually all substantial evening meals do, your pancreas releases insulin to manage the incoming glucose. In adults over 60, insulin sensitivity is typically reduced. The cells respond less efficiently to insulin signal, so the pancreas compensates by producing more insulin to achieve the same glucose clearing effect. That elevated nocturnal insulin level does not merely manage blood sugar. It triggers 3 simultaneous cardiovascular consequences that compound the pressure problem directly. First, elevated insulin promotes sodium retention in the kidneys. Retained sodium increases fluid volume in the bloodstream. Increased fluid volume directly raises blood pressure, adding a second independent pressure signal on top of the postprandial surge already underway. Second, elevated insulin activates the sympathetic nervous system further, adding a third pressure-raising mechanism from the same meal. Your cardiovascular system is now receiving multiple simultaneous signals to raise pressure, all originating from a single behavioral choice made at the dinner table hours earlier. Third, and this is critical, elevated nocturnal insulin triggers endothelial inflammation, a pro-inflammatory response in the inner lining of your blood vessel walls. This is not minor irritation. This is the mechanism that destabilizes arterial plaques, the fatty deposits that line aging arteries. When those plaques become inflamed and destabilized, they can rupture. A ruptured plaque triggers a blood clot. A blood clot in a coronary artery is a heart attack. A blood clot that travels to the brain is a stroke. This inflammatory process has a name in gerontological research. They call it inflammaging, the chronic low-grade arterial inflammation now recognized as the single most consistent biological foundation of age-related cardiovascular disease. It is measurable in the blood as elevated C-reactive protein and interleukin-6. A study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that adults over 60 who consistently ate their last substantial meal within 2 hours of bedtime showed significantly elevated C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 in their morning blood draws compared to those who finished eating at least 3 hours before sleep. And this held true even after controlling for total caloric intake and dietary composition. The timing of the meal, independent of what the meal contained, was driving the inflammatory signal, a nightly inflammatory trigger applied to arterial walls already carrying decades of cumulative wear, every single night, for years. The third mechanism receives perhaps the least public attention and may be the most immediately dangerous of all. It involves the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the chest cavity directly alongside the heart and down into the abdomen. The vagus nerve is the primary highway of the parasympathetic nervous system and plays a central role in regulating heart rate, cardiac rhythm, and the electrical conduction system of the heart. When your stomach is full and distended with food, stretch receptors in the stomach wall are activated. These receptors are vagally innervated, meaning the mechanical pressure of a full stomach directly and reflexively stimulates vagal nerve fibers. In a young adult with a resilient and well-regulated autonomic system, this vagal stimulation is mild and smoothly absorbed without consequence. In an older adult whose arterial walls are already stiffened, whose baroreceptors are already blunted, whose nocturnal blood pressure is already elevated by the first 2 mechanisms I described, that same vagal stimulation from a distended stomach lands in a completely different cardiovascular environment. An environment already under pressure, already in the window of peak nocturnal vulnerability. And in that environment, vagal stimulation from food in the stomach can trigger cardiac arrhythmias, abnormal heart rhythms, conduction pauses where the heart momentarily stops beating. and in vulnerable individuals, potentially fatal rhythm disturbances from which the heart does not recover. A study published in Heart Rhythm examined patients who had experienced documented nocturnal arrhythmic events, episodes captured on cardiac monitors during sleep, and compared them against matched controls. The patients in the arrhythmic event group showed substantially higher rates of substantial late evening meals in the 48 hours preceding their events compared to the control group. The association between a full stomach, vagal activation, and nocturnal arrhythmia in older adults was direct, consistent, and reproducible. Now I want you to consider all three mechanisms operating together in the same body at the same time. Postprandial blood pressure surge that persists for hours. Nocturnal arterial inflammation driven by elevated insulin. Vagal arrhythmia, risk from a distended stomach pressing on nerve fibers that directly influence cardiac rhythm. All three reaching their combined peak in the same 2 to 4 hour overnight window, in a body that is horizontal, unconscious, and hours away from any possible medical intervention. This is the cardiovascular environment that a late substantial meal creates every single night in older adults who have never been warned about it. This is what was happening inside the woman I told you about at the beginning. This is what was happening inside the man who survived and said no one had ever told him. And this is what may be happening inside you tonight if you eat your dinner at 8:30 and go to bed at 10. Not every older adult faces equal risk from this pattern, but 5 specific profiles carry substantially elevated vulnerability, and I want to name them directly so there is no ambiguity about who needs to hear this most urgently. Adults over 65. The compounding of reduced baroreceptor sensitivity, progressive arterial stiffening, and diminished autonomic responsiveness is not static. It worsens with each passing year. The further past 60 you are, the less buffering capacity your cardiovascular system retains to manage a postprandial pressure surge during sleep. The same meal that a 62-year-old might process with only a modest nocturnal elevation could push a 74-year-old into a clinically dangerous pressure range during the early morning hours. Age alone is a meaningful risk multiplier here, and it deserves to be acknowledged directly. Anyone with diagnosed hypertension, even if it is well controlled by medication, your daytime readings are acceptable because your medication was specifically calibrated to produce those daytime readings. But you are starting every night from a higher baseline pressure than a person with naturally normal blood pressure. Any nocturnal surge driven by a late meal pushes you further into dangerous territory from that already elevated starting point. The margin between your controlled baseline and a dangerous nocturnal peak is narrower than your office readings suggest. Your medication is working during the day. It may not be working hard enough at 2 in the morning when you have added a full dinner on top of it 2 hours before bed. Anyone with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. Insulin dysregulation is the defining feature of both conditions. The elevated nocturnal insulin response I described, the compounded sodium retention, the sympathetic activation, the endothelial inflammation, all of it is amplified in anyone whose insulin sensitivity is already compromised. The inflammatory cascade is not only more pronounced in your body, it is operating on top of the existing vascular damage that years of glucose dysregulation have already produced independently. You are adding nightly inflammation to vessels that are already inflamed. The compounding effect is not additive. It is multiplicative. Anyone with a history of cardiac arrhythmia or irregular heartbeat. If your heart has already demonstrated vulnerability to rhythm disturbance, atrial fibrillation, supraventricular tachycardia, heart block, premature ventricular contractions, or any documented arrhythmic condition, the vagal stimulation mechanism from late-night eating represents a specific, named, elevated risk to you personally. Your cardiac electrical system has already shown it can be disrupted. The conditions created by a full stomach pressing on vagal nerve fibers during the most vulnerable hours of the night are specifically and directly conducive to that disruption recurring. This is not general advice for you. This is targeted risk.